It's the end of the year, and I'm doing my favorite thing. I'm reflecting on my favorite books throughout this year, and frankly, last year. So I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about my 5 favorite books of this year, and I'm going to include a few, or rather one from last year, because it was so important to me. If you watch this video, you can comment below what your 5 favorite books of the year were. I am going to use 2 points or 2 sets of criteria to decide what my favorite books are. One, it's peculiar to me, is how much ink I've spilt in my journal, sort of reflecting on the book. And the second and most important criteria I use is how many subsequent books that particular book made me read. I tend to do this. If I'm passionate about a topic, I keep reading until the passion is sort of burnt out, and I can take a more moderate approach. Okay, let's get started. My favorite book of the year is, I think this was the easiest one for me. I just couldn't pick any other book. It's the reason I started this podcast. It's transformed my conception of a particular point in history and my understanding of Swazi history, and it has consumed me for the last 6 months. It started this whole podcasting hobby, and that is Kings, Commoners, and Concessionaires by Philip Bonner. It's a history of Swaziland from its conception until about 1889. That is the passing of King Banzeni and the ascension to power of Queen Regent Plow. It is the most important book I read this year, without a shadow of a doubt. Its conceptual insights, the rich archival research, and the fact that I'm very, shall we say, anti-Marxist, anti-structuralist, and take a very jaundiced view of anybody that is sympathetic to that worldview. But Philip Bonner is trained in the structuralist tradition, and it was an important part of his training, and it's an important part of the concepts he lays forward. But his training was leavened by a rich appreciation of the social history of Swaziland, of anthropology, of human agency, which I found really excellent. It made me get into David Hedges, Slater, and a whole slew of other books. I've read multiple books, into the tens of books, multiple academic papers, because of how important this book was. It was the inspiration for this podcast. The only other book that was the contender for the #1 spot, because of how much I enjoyed reading the book, was Hilda Cooper's An African Aristocracy, Rank Amongst the Swazi. But I couldn't pick it because it's not the centerpiece of the podcast I started, although it's really interesting. I haven't read a book that has such rich and interesting footnotes. It's really amazing, and I advise everybody to read it. My second favorite book of the year in the past year is Armies of Sand by Kenneth Pollack. This book is a study in a particular question. So from about 1945 to the present, almost every Arab army has underperformed military-wise. And Kenneth Pollack was trying to understand, why is that the case? And he starts with 1945 because this is the advent of modernity. And you would go back in history where Arab armies did perform much, much better. I mean, the famous explosion of the Arabs from Central Arabia outwards and the conquest of the Muslims of much of the modern Middle East is a story of Arab military conquest and ability. But why, since 1945, have they underperformed? Kenneth Pollack's cultural analysis, his cultural hypothesis, I found really interesting, and it led me down one of these rabbit holes I go down. And so I kept reading. I looked for other books. I tried to corroborate to see if his thesis was right or incorrect. And in fact, I found it so influential that I ended up writing a series of 3 essays that were a meditation on Pollack. I read many, many books trying to see, do other books jive with Pollack's thesis? And I found that by and large, Pollack is right. There's a lot that I think Pollack doesn't flesh out in his work. And I think if you read, for example, there's an excellent book called Saddam's Generals, and you read General Hamdani's interview, and you figure out part of the reason the Iraqi army performed so poorly against Iran are elements that Pollack doesn't flesh out enough. Incidentally, I really enjoyed that book as well because I found Hamdani an interesting and capable military officer, and I found his quirk or tendency to sort of brag, or the humble brag through his military knowledge, really endearing, I think the word. Third on the list is A History of the Muslim World by Michael Cook. I really enjoyed this book. I'm a big fan of Muslim history. I've read a number of books on it. I'm interested in the split between the Sunni and the Shia. I'm interested in the theological disputes. I'm interested in the early history of Islam. And really, one of the hallmarks of this is that I was really captivated by the revisionist school of the early history of Islam, influenced by people like Patricia Croner, and earlier on in his career, Michael Cook, although he's come to accept, I think with a few modifications, but by and large accept the classical view of early Muslim history. Anyone who's interested in that should also read Tom Holland's book, I believe, In the Shadow of the Sword, and you should also read his other book on Christianity called Dominion. But again, I was interested in the revisionist school for a very long time, but then I sort of slowly shed my, shall we say, almost fanatical interest in it and got back to more mainstream interests. I'm interested really now in the Salafist stream of Islam. I'm interested in the different school of jurisprudence and the theological schools. I'm currently reading, for example, an introduction on Ibn Taymiyyah. I'm reading also a book on HTS, Hayat Al-Sham and Ahmed Al-Shara, and their transformation from a Salafist, jihadist insurgency into a more mainstream Islamist party, from their transition from Jabhat al-Nusra to Hayat Al-Sham. I find interesting the way they slowly de-radicalized. But that led me again to my interest in Ibn Taymiyyah, sort of the father of the Salafist stream. And I think Michael Cook provides a great introduction, a comprehensive introduction into both early and going into the early modern period of Muslim history. And I think anybody that's interested in that should read Cook, even if you're not interested in Islam. He's just such an excellent writer, and he notes interesting points. He can be incredibly funny sometimes. So you should definitely read it. And you should also watch a podcast interview he has with DrAlice Evans. In that podcast interview, I really find Cook's humility, admitting the things he doesn't know, really admirable. And I think you rarely see that in modern scholars. Third on my list is Righteous Victims by Benny Morris. Events in the last few years obviously meant I was a little more interested in that region of the Middle East. And I was interested in reading a book that is respected by both sides. This is a part of history and really contemporary events that's heavily contested for understandable reasons. So I wanted to find someone who takes a balanced, factual approach and is respected by people who are on both sides of the fence on this particular topic. And I thought Morris's treatment was balanced, it was factual, it was not just well researched, but it sort of provided also the emotional tone of both sides, and you could understand the issue better. So anybody that's interested should definitely read Morris. And then fifth and final book on my list is, I had to write this one down, Nelson, A Dream of Glory by John Sugden. I actually picked up this book because I watched Master and Commander. I don't know why people hadn't told me about Master and Commander. It is an amazing movie. I absolutely loved it. I actually got the recommendation to watch Master and Commander from a tweet by David French. I loved it, and I thought, I need to read something about naval commanders. And if you're going to read something about naval commanders, you should probably read something about the greatest of all naval commanders. And I love books on great men. Edmund Morris's 3-part biography of Theodore Roosevelt is one of my most beloved sort of series, which is why I felt really disappointed and almost betrayed by his treatment of Ronald Reagan. But let's not get into delicate points like that. Another set of books I enjoyed, William Manchester on Churchill, is excellent. And then, of course, there is the greatest living biographer, Robert Caro on LBJ. At any rate, I really loved the Nelson biography. I was with Nelson at every moment. I was reading it and listening to the Rest is History podcast as they were doing their treatment on Nelson as well. I really loved that. And there's an excellent YouTube channel, perhaps I will link to it or write it underneath, where you can get sort of visual recreations of the battle. I thought they were great. I thought Nelson really did burn with zeal for king and country. The second part of the biography I found it disappointed me, not necessarily because of Sugden himself. The biography the second part, was as well written as the first part. However, I found that Nelson did not age with the grace that he should have. Old age, you should become more humorous, wiser. You should become more tempered. I thought his relationship with Lady Hamilton, his suspicion of Jarvis, was scandalous and very disappointing, and it sort of broke my heart a little bit. Such is life, anyway. I think a few honorable mentions are important. I was going to do a separate video on fiction, but I don't have the time for that. So I think Itamar Vieira, I think his name is, he has a book called Crooked Plow. Very short book. I thought it was really excellent and really Pulitzer Prize worthy. I thought it was amazing. The book on HTS I'm reading, I think is really good. The study of how a Salafist jihadist political movement and army sort of de-radicalizes over time is superb. And really, I'm really interested in the transformation that is Ahmed al-Sham. His roots are really from a land-owning, almost feudal family, and what is now the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, and then his family streak of political engagements. I think it's interesting that his father, for example, was a Nasserist. And I think this is a particular strain in the family, to pick up the most vibrant political strains in the Arab world. And I think really from the 2000s, the most vibrant political strains in the Arab world, whether we like it or not, have been the Salafist strain. That's why I'm also sort of getting interested reading in it. I want to see why it has such an important and powerful hold over people. Another book I'm reading currently, actually, is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. It is tremendous. I got this just a few days ago, and I've been devouring it. I absolutely loved it. And then I've been reading, or rather I read, an abridged copy of Arnold Toynbee. I really enjoyed this. It's called A Study of History. I wrote a small summary of it. Not a small summary, sorry. I wrote a small review of it, and I found it incredibly interesting. And for me, it's not only important because I really enjoyed Toynbee, but because he influenced the man that has probably had the biggest impact on my own intellectual political journey, Lee Kuan Yew. I can see why he found him so compelling. So that's it. Happy New Year to everyone, and have a good day. Thank you.